Welcome, everyone, to our investor briefing today, Sanctioning Russia's War, the case of Raiffeisen Bank International. We are working to bring you this investor briefing together with Business for Ukraine and BankTrack, who have just recently put out some new reports and investigations regarding Raiffeisen's continued operations in Russia. Just briefly, in terms of our speakers today, I am with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. My name is Rebecca DeWinter-Schmidt. I will be moderating, and we are going to hear in order from first Ellie Nichols from the Business for Ukraine Coalition. And Ellie is going to be giving us a bit of just context on the work that B4U has done together with BankTrack and more broadly to encourage companies that are contributing to the war effort to leave Russia and to address the salient material risks associated with their business activities in Russia. Then we're going to turn to Max Hammer from BankTrack. Max is going to turn specifically to the case of Raiffeisen to look at its footprint in Russia and their failure to respond to calls to exit, including allegations of their holdings being linked to sanctioned Russian companies and government bonds. And then finally, we're going to hear from Nina Prusak, who is also with the B4 Ukraine Coalition, and she's going to elaborate on a specific aspect of the EU sanctions regime called the best efforts obligation, explain to us what that is and how it's meant to avoid companies' complicity in contributing to violations of sanctions. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to turn things over to Ellie. Thanks so much, Ellie, for being here today.
And thanks to you, Rebecca, and to the Investor Alliance for convening and hosting this event today. So I'm going to briefly introduce B4 Ukraine, who we are, what we do. We're a coalition of over 100 civil society groups which came together in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine with a common goal of defunding and disarming Russia's war of aggression. Our members are united by the belief that defending Ukraine also means defending international law, human rights, and democratic values around the world. Since the full-scale invasion, the coalition has focused on the role that multinational corporations continue to play in enabling Russia's war economy, whether that's through the taxes they pay, the supply chains they support, or the technology that they provide. And for investors, simply put, the presence of a company in Russia represents both a reputational risk and also a long-term financial risk. As the US State Department comprehensively outlined in a business advisory in 2024, companies that remain active in Russia are increasingly exposed not only to sanctions and compliance risks, but because businesses are compelled under Russian law to help conscript staff and provide resources to the Russian army, that means they also risk complicity in Russia's commissioning of war crimes and crimes against humanity as part of its invasion of Ukraine. So for this reason, we have, over the past 3 years, prioritized engagement with businesses direct. The coalition maintains an active dialogue with corporate boards, executive teams, and investors like yourselves to encourage responsible decision-making, promote transparency, and support companies to make ethical exits. We also, in partnership with the Kiev School of Economics, track which companies are present in Russia and which are divesting. The Kiev School runs a website called leaverussia.org, and that is updated weekly with the latest data on company presence in Russia. And in addition to that, we have published what has now sadly become an annual paper which covers multinational corporation presence in Russia, what profits are being made, and what taxes are being paid. The latest of those reports we published earlier this year, and it's called Corporate Enablers of Russia's War in Ukraine, can be found on our website. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay. Briefly put, it contained the following findings. Firstly, there is continued significant corporate presence in Russia. Despite widespread sanctions on Russia, many multinational companies still remain operational there. In 2023, that amounted to approximately 1,600 companies, which is around 3/4 of the total number that were active at the start of the war. These companies generated over 196 billion in revenue and $16.8 billion in profit. Notably, out of those companies, 930 were from the G7 and EU, and 17 of the top 20 taxpayers were from those same countries. In 2023 alone, foreign businesses paid an estimated 21.6 billion in taxes to the Kremlin, bringing the total paid to over 41.6 billion since the full-scale invasion. And that, to put that in context, is equivalent to nearly 1/3 of Russia's projected 2025 military budget. In terms of sectoral contributions, we found that the fast-moving consumer goods sector, which encompasses brands like Mars, Nestle, and Procter & Gamble, were significant contributors. They generated around $587 billion in revenue and paid 1.5 billion in profit taxes in 2023. Other notable sectors include alcohol and tobacco, firms like Philip Morris and Japan Tobacco International, and food and beverage companies like PepsiCo, Mondelez, Coca-Cola. Finally, I should mention the financial sector's role. Banks played a really pivotal role in sustaining Russia's economy in 2023. Austria's Raiffeisen Bank International was identified, in fact, as the largest corporate taxpayer in Russia in 2023, and it alone contributed $491 million to the Kremlin that year. That's more than twice the amount of the second largest contributor. Other significant banks include Italy's Unicredit, Hungary's OTP, and China's ICBC. So I'm going to stop there by way of introduction and hand over to my colleague Max, who can talk about the specifics of the Raiffeisen case. Max.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Ellie. And yeah, just to build on that a little bit, I'm very pleased to dive into some of the coalition's work on Raiffeisen, which is coordinated here by our team at BankTrack. We've been engaging with Raiffeisen Bank International on this matter for over 3 years now, in no small part because the bank's Russian operations serve as a pretty exemplary case study for many of the risks and the contributions that Ellie has just outlined. You'll have seen now this figure around corporate tax contributions, but beyond those, there are quite a few number of aspects, both of Raiffeisen's presence in Russia, but also of its failure to exit the Russian market, which create quite substantial risks, both for the bank itself, but also for investors surrounding the bank. So just a little bit of background here, which I'm sure most of you will already be aware of. Raiffeisen Bank International is an Austrian bank, which is majority owned by a network of local cooperative Raiffeisen banks in Austria, but which mostly operates through its subsidiaries in a number of countries across Central and Eastern Europe. And the bank's subsidiary AO Raiffeisen Bank, which was opened in 1996, is the largest subsidiary of Raiffeisen Bank International by a very significant margin. Raiffeisen, as a company, has grown its presence in Russia quite aggressively since the early 2000s and continued to do so right up until early 2022, despite being warned repeatedly about the risks of these operations after the invasion of Crimea in 2014. And since the war, the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine began in February 2022, Raiffeisen's profit numbers in Russia have actually continued to grow quite steadily. Since the onset of the war, Raiffeisen has become by far the largest foreign bank in the country and also one of the only banks in Russia that continues to have access to the SWIFT payment system. And it's because of this, as well as a number of other factors, that the Kremlin has nominated Raiffeisen one of just 13 banks that it considers to be systemically important to the Russian economy. Meanwhile, the presence for Raiffeisen, if we can go back to the slide previously, meanwhile, the Raiffeisen group continues to derive more than 50% of its total profits just from its Russian operations. The Russian subsidiary continues to play an outsized role within the group as a whole. And you'll be aware of the fact that the risks of these operations are quite significant. So Ellie has laid out that companies in Russia face quite significant tax burdens, which force them to financially enable the war in Ukraine. But beyond that, like all foreign companies operating in Russia, AO Raiffeisen Bank is mandated by law to help with the conscription of its employees as soldiers for the Russian war efforts. And it's in the face of, and despite these risks, and despite the fact that Raiffeisen publicly announced that it plans to leave Russia in March 2022, that the long-standing sort of mutual dependence between Raiffeisen Bank International and the Russian war economy have made this exit much more complicated and much more protracted than was initially announced. So if we can go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about how this attempt at disengaging has looked in practice, because although Raiffeisen publicly touts an exit strategy which centers around a sale of its Russian subsidiary, AO Raiffeisen Bank, that sale has proven to be extremely complicated. Unlike some of Raiffeisen's peer banks, such as Société Générale, RBI was very slow to put its sales strategy into motion in 2022. So by the time that the bank started seriously looking for potential buyers, most of those buyers had already come under the umbrella of Western sanctions. And on top of that, a Russian court imposed what we view as a quite frivolous court order in the summer of 2024, which made it legally impossible for RBI to sell any shares in its Russian subsidiary. And we believe that this court order was rooted in a Kremlin that had a vested interest in trying to frustrate Raiffeisen's sale of its Russian subsidiary. So since that order was imposed, a sale of AO Raiffeisen Bank has been de facto impossible. But RBI, the conglomerate group, still refuses to consider any other exit routes, such as a full wind down of its Russian operations. Instead, the current path that Raiffeisen is committed to publicly is what can essentially be viewed as a sort of two-step plan to manage the risks of its Russian operations. The first step involves meeting a requirement set by the European Central Bank, which is requiring Raiffeisen to cut its Russian lending portfolios by 60% by 2026. And the second step involves, in RBI's own words, the construction of, quote, policies and procedures to be in compliance with all applicable sanctions. And that include policies that, quote, go beyond these sanctions regimes in many respects. And although that plan has been somewhat successful in reducing the overall risk exposure to Russia, it still contains quite major issues from a risk management perspective. For one, it does not really lay out a clear plan for when and whether RBI will actually deconsolidate its Russian business. And more critically, what we've seen over the past few months is that RBI has been subject to a number of investigations, both by civil society organizations, but also by journalists, that cast quite serious doubt on how these compliance policies are being put into practice. And you'll see some headlines here that show this. So since early 2024, it's been revealed that Raiffeisen continued to advertise its plans to expand its business in Russia up until the beginning of last year, that Raiffeisen maintained client relations with suppliers of the Russian arms industry until late 2024, and that AO Raiffeisen Bank helped import billions of euros and dollars in foreign cash into Russia just before the invasion, when Russian soldiers were already lining Ukraine's borders. So if we can go to the next slide here, we can talk a little more about these investigations and the fact that they render Raiffeisen's claims about its compliance and risk management procedures somewhat dubious, because those claims are put in further doubt by the investigation which we're here to discuss today, which B4Ukraine and BankTrek put out in March. So we uncovered a number of public access Russian financial filings in January 2025, which belonged to a company called Raiffeisen Capital, which is a Russian asset manager that Raiffeisen Bank International defines as a fully consolidated affiliate company, belonging wholly to the Russian subsidiary AO Raiffeisen Bank. And the filings, which we uncovered, indicate that Raiffeisen Capital continues to operate a total of 10 mutual funds in Russia, which continue to actively trade in Russian securities, even as most international investors, by contrast, stopped buying or selling Russian debt and equity shortly after the onset of the Russian war of aggression. The figures that we uncovered from these investigations specifically suggest that Raiffeisen Capital has about $337 million tied up in entities that have been subject to EU or US sanctions. And that includes investments in Russian oil and gas companies such as Gazprom, Lukoil and Rosneft, but also investments in Russian banks such as Sberbank, which fall under the EU sanctions umbrella. Most notably, though, most notably in particular in the context of the risk that it poses to the banks and investors, the filings that we uncovered indicate that Raiffeisen Capital held roughly $27 million in Ministry of Finance bonds in January 2025 that had been issued after March 9th, 2022. And this means that, first of all, Raiffeisen is apparently buying Russian government debt that was issued in wartime, but it also is notable from the perspective of EU sanctions regulations. The EU sanctions regime 833/2014 explicitly bans investors from trading securities that were issued after that cutoff date of March 9th by Russia or its government. And so beyond the ethical concerns posed by these activities, they also pose quite serious political risks that seem to stand in direct contrast with Raiffeisen's claims about the rigorosity of its sanctions compliance policies. Nina is going to expand on this in a second, but the same EU sanctions regulation that bans European investors from trading Russian sovereign debt might also apply to Raiffeisen Capital based on a best efforts clause in EU sanctions legislation from August 2024. And it's worth noting here that about $20 million worth of these bonds were apparently purchased as recently as December 2024. And based on the information that's available to us, Raiffeisen Capital may continue to market these bonds through its clients to its mutual funds. So, we hope that this analysis of the investigation can help illuminate some of the risks that currently confront RBI, but also the financial risks that some of these activities might carry for investors. And if we can go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about how RBI is managing these risks in particular. Because despite multiple efforts on our part and also on part of investors and civil society organizations, the bank unfortunately has failed to really comprehensively address the substance of some of these claims. When we asked for RBI for comment on our investigation, the response that we received, which you'll see here on the slide, did not comprehensively respond to the data and its implications. And instead, RBI simply reaffirmed that it maintains these sanctions compliance policies without elaborating on how they might have applied or failed to apply in the case of Raiffeisen Capital. Because of this lack of a comprehensive response, we then attended the bank's annual general meeting in March to try and raise these concerns with RBI directly, but the responses that we received were similarly vague. When we asked questions around how Raiffeisen ensures that its compliance and its risk management policies are effectively implemented by its Russian subsidiaries, we received essentially the same vague response, which referenced the fact that Raiffeisen maintains these policies, but did not comprehensively comment on how they are implemented in Russia. And finally, and perhaps most problematically, since we've reported on this story publicly, Raiffeisen Capital has completely removed all of this public financial documentation from its website. So the Raiffeisen Capital webpage previously contained a large number of legal filings, financial filings, etc., but that page now returns a 404 error and no public mutual fund overviews are available. So clients, investors, and journalists essentially have no way of seeing now where Raiffeisen Capital's money is going. And all of this, it should be noted, is happening as RBI faces renewed pushback, both from civil society groups in Austria, but also through several parliamentary inquiries about its activities in Russia. So the fact that the bank is refusing to comprehensively engage with questions around its compliance risks and is deleting publicly accessible information, even in this environment, seems to us to indicate that RBI may not be managing these risks in a way that would be conducive to the interests of its investors. And I'll pass on to Nina for a little bit more information on that.
Great, thank you. So I want to focus now on the legal lens specifically, through which all the exposures that Max and Ali talked about have to be viewed. So as Max mentioned, is the EU's best efforts obligation, which was introduced in 2024 under the Article 8A of the Consolidated EU Sanctions Regulations 833/2014. So Article 8A, so this best efforts clause article that you see on your screens, it's not an ethical suggestion. It's a binding a legal obligation that applies to all EU companies, all EU operators that own or control subsidiaries outside the EU, including in Russia and Belarus. So put simply, it requires EU operators to proactively ensure that their foreign subsidiaries do not take part in activities that undermine EU sanctions. So note the language of undermine. Undermining means activities that directly oppose the objectives of the sanctions, including enabling the supply of prohibited either goods or services to sanctioned countries. So this differs from circumvention, which involves attempts to bypass sanctions through legal loopholes, and in a sense, it's broader than mere sanctions violation or sanctions circumventions. So the obligation is triggered where a company retains effective control over the foreign entity. So this effective control, in Raiffeisen's case, it fully owns and has a consolidated, it's a Russian subsidiary. So the threshold for influence is very, very, very likely met. And the regulation makes it clear that in this case, so in the case of effective control, if the EU operator can influence actions of its foreign subsidiary, which undermines EU sanctions, that it must act. So now, specifically, the EU guidance also highlights that Russia is a high-risk jurisdiction. So to paraphrase, it essentially says that the rule of law in Russia is extremely weak, and in such circumstances, regulators expect even greater caution, so more frequent due diligence, stronger compliance programs, and so on from the EU operator. So the best efforts, what they look like in practice. So the EU commentary gives us a few examples. So ongoing risk assessments of subsidiaries' activities, sanctions training and internal controls, clear reporting and escalation channels, flag and stop problematic activities, transparency, and so on. So crucially, this is not, best efforts is not like a check the box exercise. So it's meant to be active and it's meant to be ongoing due diligence and additional risk managing mechanisms. So especially where state-linked instruments like Russian sovereign bonds are concerned. So if EU operators fail to act what they reasonably could have and knew, that may be seen as non-compliance. So on compliance, where does a breach happen? It happens when there's knowledge of activities undermining EU sanctions, as failure to block transactions undermining EU sanctions, and a failure to carry out appropriate due diligence regarding activities of non-EU subsidiaries, which resulted in undermining EU sanctions. To put it all of this like very briefly, the best efforts obligation opens up RBI to significant and high legal, in addition to all the financial and reputational risks of operating in Russia. And investors should be watching closely how RBI interprets and applies this responsibility and the best efforts clause, because so far the indications are that it's been taking it lightly. Right, Rebecca, back to you.
Thank you. Ellie, Maxine, a great job of covering quite a bit in just a short period of time. We already have a question in the chat function here. Before we go to that, just one quick follow-up immediately to what Maximina, you had just discussed. Given we have all this evidence that Raiffeisen's activities might be in constitution, the breach of sanctions, and this particular best efforts clause, how have the Austrian government and the EU been reacting to this information?
I'm happy to elaborate on that a little bit based on the information that's available to us. So since this investigation was made public, we and a couple of other organizations and investors and groups sort of in the orbit of this area have tried to raise this at a EU and at an Austrian governmental level. We believe that the European Union is aware of and is monitoring the situation related to Raiffeisen quite closely, particularly the allegations around its subsidiaries' investment in sanctioned Russian entities. Now, enforcement of EU sanctions legislation, of course, is not a European Union matter. It's a matter of the national sanctions offices of the respective EU member state. A Austrian or a Ukrainian journalist, apologies, attempted to raise this with the Austrian Ministry of Finance, who responded with the claim that they assume all sanctions are being complied with which did not give any reason for why that assumption was being made. It did not elaborate on the specificities of the case. So our view currently is that the Austrian government is not doing everything that it could to investigate this matter comprehensively. But that could change, and the risk that poses to investors could change in the near future. So Raiffeisen is currently facing a number of parliamentary inquiries, as well as a number of investigations in Austria around its activities in Russia. And so although the Austrian Ministry of Finance has not indicated that it's pursuing this matter actively at the moment, that well could change in the near future.
Thank you. Nina, did you want to jump in? Otherwise, I'll turn to the question that's in the chat.
No, I think actually Max covered it pretty well. I mean, obviously, so specifically under 8A, if RBI is found to have maintained effective control, and Max told me that in their internal documents they do refer to their subsidiaries that we talked about as having effective control over them, and they failed to act. It could be held that they're liable and they're in breach of the sanctions regulation. So the best efforts is, it could be enforceable, and the burden of proof would shift to the company to show that it acted appropriately, and obviously taking into consideration all of the research that we've done, that's put into question.
Thank you. Okay, so a question here from Anita, who I happen to know is from the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. Maybe, I don't know, Max, if this is something you would want to answer, but RBI is a signatory of the UN Principles of Responsible Banking under the UN EPFI. Is there any leverage here to sanction RBI, or that they maybe are in breach of these principles that may affect the ways in which they can continue to attract ESG investors? That's
yeah, I'm happy to elaborate on that a little bit. So obviously, UN Principles on Responsible Banking are a voluntary initiative, which RBI has signed up to voluntarily. Sanctions, to the extent of legal sanctions, is not something I think that RBI would be subject to on the basis of those principles. The sanctions that they might be subjecting themselves to risk on would come through the EU sanctions legislation, but there is obviously the mechanism within the UN Principles of Responsible Banking of removing a bank as a signatory if it's found to have failed to uphold the principles that it voluntarily signed up to. And additionally, Raiffeisen, continues to subject itself to a number of risks that may affect its attractiveness to ESG investors and its presence within ESG portfolios. So we've been actively engaging both with the bank itself, but also with a number of different voluntary initiatives and investors to alert them to the risks that Raiffeisen is subjecting itself to as a result of its continued presence in Russia. Whether or not that ends up leading to a situation in which they are, for example, removed from the principle as a signatory of the Principles of Responsible Banking is currently unclear, but at the very least, I think there are a number of sort of voluntary standards and initiatives that are aware of the fact that Raiffeisen is falling short of some of these principles in quite significant respects. And whether that ends up having an influence on their attractiveness to ESG investors, I can't say. I would imagine that there's a very high chance that they do. I'm not sure if anyone else would like.
And maybe I'll just jump in here because I asked the question. I mean, I guess I did. I was using the word sanction pretty loosely, just something that results in them being downgraded. This has happened with companies who have signed up to the UNGC, which is also voluntary, but where a company, breaches one of the terms of the UNGC, they get downgraded by the UN Global Compact. And this then has a roll-on effect in terms of their attractiveness for investing, and so they are no longer allowed to be part of, qualify as an Article 9 or an, fund. So just trying to figure out ways in which investors or making them less of an attractive investment vehicle, because I think they are touted to have like one of the largest sort of ESG portfolios and offerings, etc. So just kind of thinking about that, and then also noted that what they submitted to the UN EPFI is that they are reducing their Russian footprint, right? Their business in Russia, and from what I'm hearing from this conversation, they have it has increased phenomenally. So just kind of trying to figure out if there's a lever there, in terms of yeah, trying to change that.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe realizing we're already at time, maybe just a brief wrap. Oh, no, all good. Maybe just a brief wrap up in terms of responding to what Anita has just said. And this doesn't sound like there's been any kind of forthcoming statements from the principles of responsible investment, but what generally should be investors doing in terms of thinking about how to address this kind of risk that they're exposed to with Raiffeisen? And then just also noting Dominique's point that, are there any kind of guidelines that could lead to board level decisions whether or not financial institutions like Raiffeisen banks should be staying or leaving in specific regions? Maybe if I could just see if, Max, Ellie, Nina, if you one last comment before we close out here.
Why don't I take the first part of that question, Nina, if you come in on the guidelines point. So at a very top level response, Rebecca, what we think investors should be doing is conducting heightened human rights due diligence across their portfolios as a first point of understanding which of the companies you have invested in have exposure to Russia and the galaxy of human rights and other associated risks associated with doing business there. If once identified, those companies aren't able to adequately cease, prevent, or mitigate their exposure to severe human rights risks, which are, as we all know, very sadly today, evident, ongoing, entirely predictable at this point in time, then we think that they need to responsibly divest from these companies. So that's it in a nutshell. Nina, over to you on guidelines.
Yeah, so I'm not sure whether I caught the second part of the question on guidelines specifically, but I can give some broad observations. So basically, as we know, first and foremost, the existing guidance in business and human rights and its international framework, which is widely accepted, is first of all by and large voluntary. So it's limited in that effect, and then also specifically on the exits from the Russian market, it stays largely silent. However, as Ellie mentioned, it's in a sense of indirectly motivates exits. So when there's such high human rights impact, it creates a responsibility to prevent or mitigate harm, and to obviously cease activities when risks cannot be managed responsibly. Then it's at that point the company, in this case we're talking about RBI, has to exit. And obviously there's, to look at some of our work from with Before Ukraine, we've identified a slew of risks, including significant Russian legislation that essentially creates an environment in which it borderline mandates breaches of international human rights law and humanitarian law. Which is why we believe that no companies that want to stay aligned with the internationally recognized framework for business and human rights can stay in Russia without being in conflict with it. So yeah, I know we're over time, so I'm going to stop there.
Oh, no, thank you. Just want to also say there is the Business for Leaving report that Business for Ukraine has put out, which has more information, and Anita has just linked to useful guidance coming from the OHCHR on a responsible exiting and remaining. Max, any last comments before we close out here?
No, I think that's all right. Yeah, I would just add, the UN guiding principles, which we follow pretty closely on this, says that, in cases where the domestic context renders it impossible to fully follow the UN guiding principles, businesses still have an effort to demonstrate their efforts to follow those principles to the greatest extent possible. And in our case, and in the case of Before Ukraine, we take that to mean that in a case like Russia's, businesses do have a responsibility to responsibly exit. So, that kind of threshold, I think, and those guidelines are quite instructive in terms of what the obligations and what responsibilities they impose on businesses that are operating in countries and in jurisdictions such as Russia.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that closing comment. All right. Well, Ellie, Nina, Max, thank you so much. That was a really good condensed overview around the situation and risks involved of Raiffeisen's continued presence in Russia, what that means for investors. So appreciate it. Appreciate all the investors who took the time. Sorry for running over a bit. But yeah, I found this very useful, and we will be sending out the recording as well as the slides for additional information. If you guys want to review, there are also some links to relevant resources. So thanks so much, and everyone, wishing you all a wonderful remainder of your day. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.